Today we're going to hear from each of our guest writers about books and writers that have inspired them. Helen was born in Geelong, and her work covers a very broad range of genres, including feature journalism, for which she's won a Walkley, reviews, novels, short stories, screenplays and non-fiction books. She's published 3 collections of short stories: Honour and Other People's Children, Postcards from Surface and My Hard Heart. The first of her 5 novels was Monkey Grip and was made into a film, which she also wrote the screenplay for. It was followed by Moving Out, The Children's Bach and Cosmo Cosmolino. Her latest book, The Spare Room, about a woman's struggle to support her dying friend, is her first novel in 15 years. Helen has become one of our most respected writers of non-fiction. Her 5 non-fiction books include the highly controversial account of a university sexual harassment case, The First Stone, and the heart-wrenching story of the murder of a young Canberra man, Joe Cinque's Consolation. Helen, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm amazed at how nervous I am. I haven't felt nervous like this for about 15 years. No, since The First Stone came out. But I'm thinking, why am I nervous? And it's the subject that's making me anxious. A question that always reduces me to silence in an interview is, well, who are your favourite writers? And I always feel that there's a list that I should be able to give, that there's a correct list, if only I could think who might be on it. But I always blank out. It's very embarrassing. But somehow I like the idea of talking about influence, and it seemed a really sort of cool thing for everybody to talk about books they'd loved and had affected them. But I thought also it would be easy to talk about, but actually it's thrown me into a sort of a panic. I'm hopeless at history. The past is kind of blank, and even my own. And I forget everything, and whole books that I've loved and that have thrilled me while I was reading them vanish from my memory very quickly. I used to think that I was the only person that this happened to, but I've discovered that it's quite common. And I was particularly thrilled when I came across that book called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. I thought that's got to be useful. And it actually turned out to be, I thought it was going to be some kind of flip joke, but it's really very sophisticated. And I found it quite liberating. But everything that's formed me already seems to have happened such a terribly long time ago that I can hardly kind of get a grip on it. What is influence anyway? I asked myself. Now, reading, I don't remember the moment at which the penny dropped for me about reading, but I do remember I had the great luck of being present when the penny dropped for my daughter when she was about 4, and we were walking along the street. And she was a bright little girl, and we'd sort of looked at alphabet books and she knew how to sound out the letters. But we were walking along the street and she saw a sign on a shop and she started to sound out the letters. And she said, E, O, K, B, A, milk bar! And we both burst into, we were both skipping and laughing and almost crying with excitement. It was just one of those moments when somebody's intellect slots into the next stage. But I don't remember that happening to me. I seem to myself to have been reading forever, as if I sort of emerged from the womb holding a small volume of Thackeray. But the thing is that I don't seem to remember separate, distinct books very well, but there seems to have been an endless element of words on pages that I've been swimming in for the last 60 plus years. And I get a sense of falseness when I try to divide it up and name it, or if I try to sort of identify the individual droplets of this wave. Now, a few years ago I read Philip Pullman's Trilogy, His Dark Materials, and I saw reviews of it in the Times Literary Supplement, which I also read and forget every week. But there were these ecstatic reviews, and they said, well, this is a kid's book, but, it's really good. So I thought, well, I'll get it. So I read it, and it was the first time since childhood that I'd read a book with that drunken passion. It threw me back into childhood reading, that madness of reading where you just simply cannot do anything else, and you read while you're getting dressed, and the world outside that state where the world outside the book kind of blurs and becomes insubstantial. And that feeling that crazy, stunned greed to keep reading made me understand, looking back at my mother, who was always nagging me, get your nose out of that book and go outside. That was the chorus of my childhood, go outside. And there were 6 kids, so I understood why but I was just quietly lying there on the bed. I don't know why I had to go outside. But there is something a bit frightening about that greed of reading, I think. It's kind of scary when you contemplate it. It's a refusal to live directly in the body, to move and breathe in the material world. And I feel that fear when I see my grandchildren watching SpongeBob SquarePants on TV, which I love. I think it's a great show, but just there's some... My grandson's crazy about this guy, about online wrestling. And there's a character called the Great Khali, who he wants to look at all the time. And when I look at their faces when they're watching TV, there's this stunned, hypnotised look. And I think that's probably the look that my mother saw on me when I was reading, and she tried to sort of break through it with no success. But as for what I was reading back there in the 40s and 50s, I can hardly recall it. And it'd be too boring to list them, because even if I could recall it, because in some scary way, it could have been anything. I would have read anything that had been put under my nose. It was an addiction, and I'm still hooked today. I can't fall asleep or travel on public transport or sit on a toilet or wait at the doctor's or eat alone in a restaurant without having some printed matter close at hand, and I'm anxious or even panicky if I don't have something to read. But I've got this 4-year-old grandson who... he can't read yet, but he's crazy about books, and I can see this attitude forming in him. Most of his books have to be about dinosaurs, but the other day I found him on his knees at a little coffee table when I walked into their kitchen. And open on the table in front of him, he had this glossy encyclopedia of plants. It was an adult book. And he was completely lost to the world. And he was just moving his finger down the page, pointing to the labelled drawings, and he was going, dat, and dat, and dat, and dat, and dat, just going on and on. He didn't know what they were saying, but I sat down on the couch and he didn't even know I was there. But coming from that corner of the room, there was this benign hum of intellect. It was very thrilling to be near it. Well, the first person who influenced me, vis-a-vis writing, I mean you can connect it, was a teacher at my school, and I've spoken about her before. Her name's Mrs. Dunkley. She was a very frightening woman. I was actually terrified of her. But she taught me everything I know about syntax. We used to have these... there's an exercise I remember we had at school. I'd forgotten this until I started trying to think about what to say tonight. It was called transcription. Do you remember? We used to have to copy a paragraph just to practice our handwriting. But when I thought about that, I remembered Elizabeth Jolly telling me once about when she was about writing classes that she took. And we were talking about the sorts of people who came along to writing classes who had absolutely no talent, nothing to say, but just wanted to be in the class. I said, what do you do with those students, Elizabeth? She said, well, I'll tell you what I do. I tell them to get an exercise book, and when everyone else has to go and write something before the next class. But she says, I tell them, now, if you haven't got any ideas, just copy out something that you've liked in somebody else's book. But I think you could see that as a sort of almost like an act of contempt, say, oh, be off, don't bother me, just go and copy something. But copying is what artists do. It's often how they start, I think. And I know because I still use a pen quite a lot, I know that if I copy something out, there's a sense that you're sensing with your body the sort of joints of the sentence and how the weight of the sentence is gathered and carried and how it's kind of slung from one end of the sentence structure to another. That always gives me a great deal of pleasure. You have to write slowly and you can see how it's done, even though you don't know how to do it, but you can see the joints of the thing. And that reminds me of a great influence on me, which was learning German when I was at school. as most of you probably know, German's sentence structure is extremely severe and very formal. There's a kind of a German sentence is really quite sternly engineered. And I remember still the stabs of bliss that I used to feel when I got the clauses in the right order, and I could feel the whole contraption kind of chock into place. And I still get the same joy out of building a complex sentence in English. So just about every time I sit down, I don't consciously do this, but I give thanks to my high school teachers for what they taught me. They gave me the tools for the job. Now, when I got to the university in the 60s, I was studying arts at Melbourne University, and I was the most rotten student. I hardly read the work. All I was interested in was drinking and sex and hanging out down at the pub. Now, I know I must have read some things. I do remember reading Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, which I liked, and a lot of poetry, which I loved, and I think that probably sank very deeply into my mind. But I think what a university course gives you, if you're that sort of student who's still in a kind of swamp of adolescent freedom and freedom from their parents, it gives you a map of the territory that is useful later on, and that's been the case with me. But a few years ago, after I published a couple of books, I ran into a woman who used to teach at Melbourne University, and she said, "Oh, hello, Helen, it's nice to see you again." She said, "I remember you from back in the 60s. She said, "I've noticed that you've published a few books, and I thought I'd go back and have a look at your thesis and see if I could spot any sign of early talent." And I had no idea that my pathetic thesis was still in existence. But she said, anyway, I went back there and I got it, and she said, well, there was no sign of any talent whatsoever. Well, that was kind of squashing, but it was also, it was obviously true. I was a bit of a late starter. But at university, I fell in with some architecture students. Now, they were, I don't know if it's the same today, but they were considered to be quite hip at the time, and they read American writers, which I hadn't started doing, and that's how I came across Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald, people like that. See, and they seemed so fresh and muscular, and they seemed more fun than the writers we were supposed to be reading. So I read them secretly and a bit shamefully, because I was guilty because I wasn't reading Middlemarch, which I did read many years later and adored. But so I sort of thought that they were the easy option, that Scott Fitzgerald, because I enjoyed them so much and because they spoke to me so vividly. I thought, oh, these are easy, I should be reading hard stuff. I should be reading stuff I can't understand. But then, because I was also doing French, and one day we had to do a French translation exercise from English into French. And to my amazement, the lecturer had chosen the opening scene of Scott Fitzgerald's novel Tender is the Night, which I'd read 3 times and was crazy about, but secretly thought was easy. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, this will be a breeze, I know this backwards. And I sat down and tried to translate it, and I came bang up against why it was fantastic writing. It was untranslatable. How do you translate this? The tan prayer rug of the beach. I suddenly realised that this writing was actually sophisticated, and that maybe I should be not feeling guilty at all about reading it. But since I've been actually writing, or being a writer, as some people call it, I'm aware of 2 big influences on me, influences that I've consciously and purposefully and deliberately used. I think that's a different kind of influence from the sort that just flows into you spontaneously and is an element in which you intellectually kind of live. Both these writers who've influenced me are Americans. But before I go on to who they are, I should also pay tribute to a man who gave me the most useful piece of advice that I've ever had as a writer. And this links up with my first influence. This was a German guy I once met named Reinhard Lettau. He's dead now, unfortunately. But he read some of my stuff and he told me, he said, you use too many adverbs. You editorialise, you're telling the writer what to think. He said, cut the adverbs, it will leave wonderful holes. And I was rocked by that. It hit me like a thunderbolt. And I went back and looked at my work, and I could see the anxiety in it. I think anxiety often resides in adverbs. But the person whose work enacted for me this excellent piece of advice appeared in my firmament shortly afterwards, and as anyone could guess, it was the American short story writer Raymond Carver, or as we now know or have been recently informed, his extremely aggressive and fearless editor, Gordon Lish. I don't know if other people have seen the early drafts of Raymond Carver's story that have been published lately, showing the cuts made by his editor, Gordon Lish. He slashed until it bled. It's shocking. But I've read that Raymond Carver's widow, Tess Gallagher, now wants to republish a lot of the early stories in their early drafts. I think this is a terribly interesting moral problem, really. It's I was horrified when I heard that, but I'll get to that why in a minute. But what I learnt from Carver's stories is just simply how little you can have on the page and still have a very powerful story. And when I first came across Carver and read his stuff, I was thunderstruck by them. Other people's work for a while felt very clogged and ear-bashing and anxious, as if, and I know that was true about my work, I could see how anxious I was, that I didn't trust the reader to understand what I was getting at, and I clogged it. It was full. I was telling you must feel this. I'm right. I've told you this story and you must feel this about it. But so what I fell in love with Carver's work was the spareness and the silences that are there, the gaps and the wonderful holes. There's plenty of room for the reader to come flooding into the text. And I can see that you can dare to trust the reader. Now, the other person who's greatly influenced me is another American writer called Janet Malcolm. Now, her work it's deeply imbued with what she calls the psychoanalytic view of reality. It's basic, and I'm going to read you, this is a sentence from one of her essays. I believe that her father was a psychoanalyst, so I think psychoanalytic thinking was an element in which she swam for her entire life. She's talking about the psychoanalytic view of reality and its basic doctrine that life is lived on two levels of thought and act, one in our awareness and the other only inferable from dreams, slips of the tongue and inexplicable behaviour. Now, this came into its own for me when I started writing non-fiction. What really was tremendously useful for me was seeing the way that Malcolm observes and permits herself to interpret the behaviour and body language of people she's interviewing. And seeing the way she did this blasted that whole endeavour wide open for me. There's a link there between that freedom and learning to free associate, as you do when you're in psychoanalytic therapy. It's very exhilarating to learn to trust and follow the leaps of association that are always there in your mind, leading towards deeper meaning. But it took me many years to have the nerve to do that, to trust flashes of insight and flashes of association. Of course, what they do is that's what metaphor is. I think it's the leaps of mind that link thoughts together. But there's this is my little poem to Janet Malcolm now. So there's something in her writing that draws me in and affects me as no other writing does. I must have read, many of you might know her most famous book is called The Journalist and the Murderer, which is the most enthralling book. Now, I must have read it a dozen times and I still can't remember the outcome of the lawsuit that it's about. And it puzzles me that I don't remember it. Well, it used to puzzle me until I thought about it. And I think I love to get into one of her books and just kind of be in there. There's a texture in her writing that's very crisp and dry, but she's capable of surprising moments of warm sympathy. But her writings, once again, it's like an element in which I can exist in full alertness for hours at a time. See, I usually read lying on the bed, and that means that I go to sleep. But when I'm reading Janet Malcolm, I want to sit up at the table. I feel that I want to pay her full attention. Her work moves forward very fast. The critic David Reef used the expression her rhetorical velocity about the way she writes. I think that's a good word for it, good term for it. But when I'm reading her, I'm aware of the constant soft sound of the scales falling from my eyes. Or as a woman once remarked to me after listening to a lecture by a respected Sydney psychoanalyst, she said, the whole time he was talking, I felt as if rocks were being removed from my head. And that's what I feel like when I'm reading her. Now, years ago, I heard Richard Ford give a reading, and he read a short story by John Cheever, who now come to think of it is a writer I greatly admire. And he read the Cheever story, and then he read a story of his own that was kind of similar to it in certain ways. And I remember noticing at the time that this was rather, audacious, but it was a risk because the Cheever story was so much better than his. And this might be about to happen here. I want to show two examples of what Janet Malcolm does and then read a little bit out of one of my books that I couldn't have written if I hadn't read these things of hers. How are we going for time? Do you want me to speed it up a little? You can. Right, okay, I'll just read one. Okay, there's this scene where I thought I didn't have enough to say. There's a scene in her book about the Sylvia Plath biographers where, actually I might just skip it, I'll just sum it up. She's talking about a scene where Sylvia Plath comes upon some girls in a park hacking off some rhododendron bushes that they wanted to use as decoration for a dance. And she abuses these women and tells them they must stop. Meanwhile, in her hand, she had a pair of scissors and a rose, which she had also stolen from the park. But the point that Janet Malcolm makes about this is that what Sylvia Plath was not daring to do was to steal and rob. She said, that's what artists do. Art is not pleasing your mother. That scene, which I'm afraid I haven't left myself enough time to read, is one that inspired me when I was trying to write about this old man that I was interviewing. Now, this is going to be the end of my talk. I was interviewing an old man who knew a lot about this story I was trying to research. This is the first stone. He knew the whole background story and he wouldn't tell it to me. And he was an old judge and he was a very smart old lawyer. He knew how not to answer a question. So I kept asking him things and he kept saying, oh, no names, no pack drill. So this is the little passage. And I wouldn't have been able to interpret this gesture of his had I not read the Janet Malcolm. A cuckoo popped out of a clock and called the hour. It's 11 o'clock, he said, standing up. I'll put the kettle on. He soon returned, carrying a tray of plunger coffee and a jar of homemade biscuits. He took a biscuit for himself and put the jar on the small table beside me. I ate one. It was excellent, the absolutely perfect biscuit. I remarked on this and took another, then perhaps another. 10 minutes later, without breaking off what he was saying, he got up from his chair, walked over to my table and replaced the lid on the biscuit jar. He was halfway back to his seat when he suddenly stopped, turned towards me and said, I didn't do that to keep you out of there. We both laughed, but I thought, yes, you did, sir. You were putting the lid back on what you know. I won't get any more out of you. Now, I'm glad I didn't read the Janet Malcolm because hers is so much better than mine. But I just want to end with one sentence from another writer, and this seems to me to link up with my terrible forgetfulness. This is a writer called Marion Milner. Everything that one thinks one understands has to be understood over and over again in its different aspects, each time with the same new shock of discovery. Thanks.
Today we're going to hear from each of our guest writers about books and writers that have inspired them. Luke Davies is a poet, novelist, journalist and feature writer. He was born in Sydney. He's the author of 3 novels, Isabel the Navigator, which was followed by the much celebrated Candy, about the lives of 2 lovers with a long-term junk habit. Candy's been published in the UK, the US, and it's been translated into German, Hebrew and French. And a film version starring Heath Ledger won the AFI for Best Adapted Screenplay. Luke was awarded the Philip Hodgins Memorial Medal for Poetry in 2004. He's published 5 books of poetry, including Running with Light, which won the Judith Wright Poetry Prize in 2000, and Totem, which won the 2004 Age Book of the Year. His latest book is a gripping, feverish novel about the whirlwind life of a drug-addicted and obsessive Howard Hughes, his astonishing achievements, his internal world, and the many ways in which he represented aspects of the century in which he lived.